Dianetics, the original thesis, by L. Ron Hubbard. Introduction. In 1932, an investigation was undertaken to determine the dynamic principle of existence in a workable form, which might lead to the resolution of some of the problems of mankind. A long research in ancient and modern philosophy culminated in 1938 in the heuristically discovered primary law. A work was written at that time which embraced man and his activities. In the following years, further research was undertaken in order to prove or disprove the axioms so established. Certain experiences during the war made it necessary for the writer to resolve the work into applicable equations, and an intensive program was begun in 1945 toward this end. A year later, many techniques had been discovered or evolved, and a nebulous form of the present refined work was formulated. Financed chiefly by a lump sum disability compensation, that form of Dianetics was intensively applied to volunteer subjects, and the work gradually developed to its present form. Dianetics has been under test by the writer, as here delineated, for the past 4 years. The last series of random volunteers, numbering 20, were rehabilitated, 20 out of 20, with an average number of work hours of 52 per subject. Dianetics has been found to successfully resolve migraine headaches, ulcers, arthritis, astigmatism, bursitis, stammering, glandular imbalance, asthma, allergies, and other psychosomatic ills. It has also successfully removed any compulsions, repressions, neuroses, and psychoses to which it has been applied. L. Ron Hubbard, 1948. Part 1. Discoveries and Principles. Chapter 1. Primary Axioms. Dianetics is a heuristic science built upon axioms. Workability rather than truth has been consulted. The only claim made for these axioms is that by their use, certain definite and predictable results can be obtained. The principal achievement of Dianetics lies in its organization. Almost any of its parts can be found somewhere in history, even when they were independently evolved by the writer. There are no principal sources, and where a practice or a principle is borrowed from some past school, the connection is usually accidental and does not admit any further use or validity of that school. Dianetics will work, and can only be worked, when regarded and used as a unity. When diluted by broader applications of older practices, it will no longer produce results. To avoid confusion and prevent semantic difficulties, new and simplified terminology has been used, and is used only as defined herein. Dianetics is actually a family of sciences. It is here addressed in the form of a science of thought, applicable to psychosomatic ills and individual aberrations. The field of thought may be divided into 2 areas, which have been classified as the knowable and the unknowable. We are here concerned only with the knowable. In the unknowable, we place that data which we do not need to know in order to solve the problem of improving or curing of aberrations of the human mind. By thus splitting the broad field of thought, we need not now concern ourselves with such indefinites as spiritualism, deism, telepathy, clairvoyance, or, for instance, the human soul. Conceiving this split as a line drawn through the area, we can assign a dynamic principle of existence to all that data remaining in the knowable field. After exhaustive research, one word was selected as embracing the finite universe as a dynamic principle of existence. This word can be used as a guide or a measuring stick, and by it can be evaluated much information. It is therefore our first and our controlling axiom. The first axiom is survive. This can be seen to be the lowest common denominator of the finite universe. It embraces the conservation of energy and all forms of energy. It further delineates the purpose of that energy so far as it is now viewable by us in the knowable field. The activity of the finite universe can easily be seen to obey this axiom as though it were a command. all works and energies can be considered to be motivated by it. The various kingdoms have this as their lowest common denominator, for animals, vegetables, and minerals are all striving for survival. We do not know to what end we are surviving, and in our field of the knowable and in our choice of only the workable axioms, we do not know and have no immediate reason to ask why. All forms of energy are then surviving to some unknown end for some unknown purpose. We need only to know that they are surviving, and that as units or species, they must survive. By derivation from the first workable axiom, we come into possession of the second. In obedience to the command survive, life took on the form of a cell, which, joining with other cells, formed a colony. The cell, by procreating, expanded the colony. The colony, by procreating, formed other colonies. Colonies of different types united, and necessity, mutation, and natural selection brought about specializing, which increased the complexity of the colonies until they became an aggregation. The problems of the colonial aggregation were those of food, protection, and procreation. In various ways, a colonial aggregation of cells became a standardized unity, and any advanced colonial aggregation came into possession by necessity, mutation, and natural selection of a central control system. The purpose of the colonial aggregation was to survive. To do this, it had to have food, means of defense, protection, and means of procreation. The control center which had developed had as its primary command, survive. Its prime purpose was the food, defense, protection, and means of procreation. Thus can be stated the second workable axiom. The purpose of the mind is to solve problems relating to survival. The ultimate success of the organism, its species or life, would be at its unimaginable extreme, immortality. The final failure, in obedience to the law survive, would be death. Between eternal survival and death lie innumerable gradations. In the middle ground of such a scale would be mere existence, without hope of much success, and without fear of failure. Below this point would lie step by step innumerable small errors, accidents, losses, each one of which would tend to abbreviate the chances of reaching the ultimate goal. Above this point would lie the small successes, appreciations, and triumphs, which would tend to secure the desirable goal. As an axiom, the mind can then be said to act in obedience to a central basic command, survive, to direct or manage the organism in its efforts to accomplish the ultimate goal for the individual or species or life, and to avoid for the individual or species or life any part of the final failure, which leads to the stated axiom, the mind directs the organism, the species, its symbiotes, or life, in the effort of survival. The Dianetic meaning of symbiote is extended beyond the dictionary definition, the living together of two dissimilar organisms, to mean any or all life or energy forms which are mutually dependent for survival. The atom depends on the universe on the atom. A study of the field of evolution will indicate that survival has been, will be, and is the sole test of an organism, whether the organism is treated in the form of daily activity or the life of the species. No action of the organism will be found to lie without the field of survival, for the organism is acting within its environment, upon information received or retained, and error or failure does not alter the fact that its basic impulse was motivated by survival. Another axiom may then be formulated as follows. The mind, as the central direction system of the body, poses, perceives, and resolves problems of survival, and directs or fails to direct their execution. As there are many organisms in the same species all attempting to accomplish the same end, and as there are many species, and as matter itself is attempting in one unit form or another to survive, there is necessarily conflict and contest among the individuals of the species, other species, or units of matter. Species cannot survive without being interested primarily in the species. Natural selection and other causes have established this as a primary rule for survival, that the unit remain alive as long as possible as a unit, and by association and procreation, that the species remain alive as a species. Second-grade interest is paid by the unit or the species to its symbiotes. Third-grade interest is paid to inanimate matter. As this is apparently the most workable solution, natural selection best preserves those species which follow this working rule, and the symbiotes of the successful species, therefore, have enhanced opportunity for survival. Man is the most successful organism currently in existence, at least on this planet. Man is currently winning in the perpetual cosmic election, which possibly may select the thinker of the new thought. Man is heir to the experience and construction of his own ancestors. As cellular conservatism is one of the factors of survival, his mind is basically the same mind which directed and resolved the problems of his animal forebears. By evolution and natural selection, this mind, therefore, has the primary priority in emergencies. Superimposed on this animal mind has been developed an enormously complex analyzer, which probably exists as his frontal lobe. The command survive is variable in individuals and species to the extent that it may be strong or weak. Superior strength of the command in the individual or species is normally but variably a survival factor. The primary facet of personality is the basic strength of the dynamic drive. Dynamic, the dynamic thrust into time and space of an individual, a species, or a unit of matter or energy, especially defined for the purpose of Dianetics as survive. The dynamic is variable from individual to individual and race to race. It is varied by physiology, environment, and experience. Its manifestation in the animal mind affects both the tenacity of the individual to life or purpose, and it affects the activity of the analyzer. The first characteristic of the individual which should be considered is the basic strength of his dynamic, by which an axiom can be formulated. The persistency of the individual in life is directly governed by the strength of his basic dynamic. The analytical, human, or as it has elsewhere been called erroneously, the conscious mind, is variable from individual to individual and race to race in its ability to perceive and resolve problems. Another axiom can then be formulated. Intelligence is the ability of an individual, group, or race to resolve problems relating to survival. It should be noted that there is a distinct difference between the dynamic and the intelligence. High intelligence may not denote high dynamic. High dynamic may not denote high intelligence. Intelligence is mental sensitivity and analytical ability. Dynamic is the persistency of the individual in obedience to the command, survive. It has been noted that there is a gradation in the scale of survival. Gains toward the ultimate goal are pleasurable. Failures toward the final defeat are sorrowful or painful. Pleasure is therefore the perception of well-being or an advance toward the ultimate goal. Pain, therefore, is the perception of a reduction toward the final defeat. Both are necessary survival factors. For the purpose of Dianetics, good and evil must be defined. Those things which may be classified as good by an individual are only those things which aid himself, his family, his group, his race, mankind, or life in its dynamic obedience to the command, modified by the observations of the individual, his family, his group, his race, or life. As evil may be classified those things which tend to limit the dynamic thrust of the individual, his family, his group, his race, or life in general in the dynamic drive, also limited by the observation, the observer, and his ability to observe. Good may be defined as constructive. Evil may be defined as destructive. Definitions modified by viewpoint. The individual man is an organism attempting to survive in affinity or contest with other men, races, and the three kingdoms. His goal is survival for himself, his progeny, his group, his race, his symbiotes, life, and the universe in general, in contest with any efforts or entities which threaten or impede his efforts to attain the goal. His happiness depends upon making, consolidating, or contemplating gains toward his goal. It is a purpose of Dianetics in general, and abnormal Dianetics in particular, to pass man across the abyss of irrational, solely reactive thought, and enter him upon a new stage of constructive progression to the ultimate goal. Chapter 2. An Analogy of the Mind. It is not the purpose of abnormal Dianetics to investigate or accurately reconstruct the human mind. The purpose of abnormal Dianetics is to delete from the existing mind those physically painful experiences which have resulted in the aberration of the analytical mind, to erase from the body psychosomatic illnesses, which are physical abnormalities and the physical manifestation of the aberration, and to restore in its entirety the proper working function of a mind not otherwise physically deranged. Abnormal Dianetics embraces the various physiological aspects of psychosomatic medicine, including the glandular balance or imbalance of the organism, as influenced by painful physical experiences. The measurement and increase of the dynamic is the practice and study of dynamic Dianetics, which subject is not included in this manual. The initial adjustments of the individual are included in child Dianetics and educational Dianetics. Surgical and medical procedures, as they affect the mind, are covered in medical Dianetics, which is briefly touched upon in this manual. Judicial Dianetics, political Dianetics, and military Dianetics are elsewhere touched upon or allocated for study. Dianetics as a family of sciences proceeds, however, from the axioms cursorily touched upon in the last chapter, and is uniformly governed by the principles of the behavior of the human mind, as enhanced by the techniques of abnormal Dianetics. All human activity proceeds primarily from the impulses covered in the primary science, dynamic Dianetics, which deals, as above, with the basic dynamic, its measurement and enhancement. The existence and variability of this dynamic are not primarily a subject for abnormal Dianetics, but must be considered as the only primary thrust in obedience to which the mind and body react. When the individual is acting contrary to the survival of himself, his group, progeny, race, mankind, or life, he can be considered to be unintelligent, uninformed, or aberrated. Every single instance of aberrated conduct threatening the general goal of the individual, as outlined in the last chapter, can be proven to have a source which will specifically be found to be a painful experience containing data not available to the analytical mind. Every single instance and facet of aberrated conduct has its exact causation in the physically painful error which has been introduced during a moment of absence of the analytical power. Abnormal Dianetics consists of discovering the aberration in the individual, finding the physically painful experience which corresponds to it, and deleting the perceptic content of that experience from the body and mind. More as an effort to demonstrate how that is accomplished than as an actual outline of the character of the mind, the following analogy is offered. First, there is the physio-animal section of the mind. This contains the motor controls, the subbrains, and the physical nervous system in general, including the physical aspect of the analytical section of the mind. The control of all voluntary and involuntary muscles is contained in this section. It commands all body fluids, blood flow, respiration, glandular secretion, cellular construction, and the activity of various parts of the body. Experimentation has adequately demonstrated this. The physio-animal mind has specific methods of thinking. These are entirely reactive. Animal experimentation, rats, dogs, etc., is experimentation on and with precisely this mind, and little more. It is a fully conscious mind, and should never be nominated by any term which denies it consciousness, since there is no period in the life of the organism, from conception to death, when this mind is not awake, observing and recording perceptions. This is the mind of a dog, cat, or rat, and is also the basic mind of a man, so far as its operating characteristics are concerned. A man in the deepest possible somnambulistic sleep is still in possession of more mind and thinking and coordinating ability than a lower animal. The term consciousness is no more than a designation of the awareness of now. The physio-animal mind never ceases to be aware of now, and never ceases to record the successive instances of now, which in their composite make up a time track which connects memory in an orderly chain. Cessation of life alone discontinues the continual recording of perceptions on this orderly track. Unconsciousness is a condition wherein the organism is discoordinated only in its analytical process and motor control direction. In the physio-animal section of the mind, a complete time track and a complete memory record of all perceptions for all moments of the organism's existence is available. As life progresses, for instance, from a blade of grass to a dog, greater and greater complexities and degrees of self-determinism are possible. Energy, in its various forms, is the primary motivator in the lower orders. But as the complexity of the order is increased into the animal kingdom, the physio-animal mind attains more and more command of the entire organism, until it itself begins to possess the second section of the mind. All animals possess in some slight degree an analyzer. This which we designate the analytical mind is present even in lower orders, since it is only that section of the mind which possesses the self-deterministic coordinative command of the physio-animal mind, and thus of the body. In a rat, for instance, it is no more than its conscious awareness of now, applying to lessons of then, without rationality, but with instinct and painful experience. This is the analytical section of the mind in a lower animal. But it is the reactive mind in a man, whose analytical mind is so highly attuned and intricate that it can command entirely both the physio-animal mind and thus the body. Man not only possesses a superior physio-animal mind, but possesses as well an analytical mind of such power and complexity that it possesses no real rival in any other species. The analytical mind of man cannot be studied by observing the reactions of animals under any situations. Not only is it more sensitive, but it possesses factors and sensitivities not elsewhere found. Continuing this analogy, lying between the analytical mind and the physio-animal mind may be conceived the reactive mind. This is the coordinated responses of the physio-animal mind, the analytical mind of animals, and the first post of emergency command in man. All errors of a psychic or psychosomatic nature can be considered, for the purposes of this analogy, to lie in the reactive mind. The first human analytical mind took command of the body and physio-animal mind under strained and dangerous circumstances, when man was still in violent contest with other species around him. It can be considered that the analytical mind received command with the single proviso that instantaneous emergency would be handled by the outdated but faster reactive mind. Any and all errors in thinking and action derive from the reactive mind, as it is increased in strength and power by painful experience. It can be called a shadow mind, instantaneously reactive when any of its content is perceived in the environment of the individual, at which time it urgently bypasses the analytical mind and causes immediate reaction in the physio-animal mind and in the body. Additionally, the reactive mind is in continual presence when chronically restimulated by a constantly present restimulator, which is to say, an approximation of the reactive mind's content, or some part thereof, continually perceived in the environment of the organism. The reactive mind is in action so long as it is activated by an exact or nearly exact approximation of its content. But given too continuous a restimulation, it can and does derange both the physio-animal mind and body below it, and the analytical mind above it. It was created by deranging circumstances of a physical nature, hence it deranges. The entire content of the reactive mind is records of physical pain with its accompanying perceptions during disconnection of the analyzer. All aberrated conduct and error on the part of an individual is occasioned by restimulation of his reactive mind. None of these minds are unconscious, nor are they subconscious. The entire organism is always conscious. But the temporary dispersion of the thought processes of the analytical mind brings about a condition whereby that mind, having been dispersed and considering itself the residence of person, is unable to obtain and reach data perceived and received by the organism during the analytical mind's condition of dispersion. That the analytical mind can be thrown by pain or shock out of circuit is a survival factor of its own. As sensitive machinery, it must be protected by a fuse system. Chapter 3. The Dynamics. The basic dynamic, survive, increases in complexity as the complexity of the organism evolves. Energy may be considered to have taken many paths through eternity to arrive intact at the infinite goal. The why of the goal may lie above the finite line, but below it, demarked by the word survive, definite manifestations are visible. Energy collects into various forms of matter, which collect and aggregate in various materials and compounds. Life evolves from the simplest basic into complex forms, since evolutionary change is in itself a method of survival. Conflict among species and individuals within the species is additionally a survival factor. Affinity of individuals for groups, races, and the whole of its species, and for other species, is additionally a survival factor, as strong or stronger than conflict. Dynamic is defined as the dynamic thrust through time toward the attainment of the goal. Survive is considered to be the lowest common denominator of all energy efforts and all forms. It can then be subdivided specifically into several dynamic lines as applicable to each form or species. The unaberrated self contains 4 main dynamics, which are held in common with man. The 4 dynamics are not new forces. They are subdivisions of the basic dynamic. The dynamics are 1. Personal, 2. Sex, 3. Group, and 4. Mankind. An entire philosophy can be built around each one of these dynamics, which will account for all the actions of an individual. Any one of these philosophies is so complete that it can be logically made to include the other 4. In other words, all purpose of an individual can be rationalized into the personal dynamic. A philosophy exists which attempts to rationalize everything into the sexual dynamic, and so on with all the dynamics. Observing that each one can stand as a logical unity, one finds it necessary to retire to the lowest common denominator of the basic dynamic, which actually does explain the 4 subdivisions. As each one of the subdivisions is capable of supporting the whole weight of a rational argument, it can readily be deduced that each is of nearly equal importance in the individual. The aberrated conditions of a society tend to vary the stress on these dynamics, making first one and then another the keynote of the society. In an unaberrated individual or society, the validity of all 4 would be recognized. The unaberrated individual may physiologically possess or environmentally stress one or more of these dynamics above the others. In terms of basic personality, as covered in the field of dynamic Dianetics, the physiological, environmental, educational aspect of the individual is varied in strength in the 4 dynamics. Each one of the 4 dynamics breaks further into purposes which are specific and complex. Purposes and other factors entangle these dynamics in varying situations, and the observational power of the individual may conflict one against another of these dynamics within the individual himself. This is a basic complex factor of the unaberrated personality. 1. The personal dynamic consists of the dynamic thrust to survive as an individual, to obtain pleasure as an individual, and to avoid pain. It covers the general field of food, clothing, and shelter, personal ambition, and general individual purpose. 2. The sexual dynamic embraces the procreation of progeny, the care of that progeny, and the securing for that progeny of better survival conditions and abilities in the future. 3. The group dynamic embraces the various units of the species man, such as the association, the military company, the people in the surrounding countryside, the nation, and the race. It is characterized by activity on the part of the individual to obtain and maintain the survival of the group of which he is a part. 4. The mankind dynamic embraces the survival of the species. While man is concerned with any one of the above dynamics, any one of them may become antipathetic to his own survival. This is rational conflict, and is normally and commonly incident to survival. It is non-aberrative in that it is rational within the educative limitation. The family as a unit is not a dynamic, but a combination of dynamics. And in this and other societies, it attains a position of interest which is not necessarily inherent in the individual or group. Basically simple, complexity is introduced among the dynamics by individual and group irrationalities. The basic, unaberrated individual has continual difficulty rationalizing the problems of importances and choices among these dynamics. When the basic individual becomes aberrated and is attendantly unable to reason freely on all problems, a selection of importances among these dynamics becomes nearly impossible, and produces aberrated solutions which may resolve such an extreme as the destruction of the individual himself, by himself, under the mistaken solution that he may thus obey the primary command. Note, all self-destructive effort is irrationality of a precise nature, which will often be found by the auditor in a person under treatment, but which forms no part of the basic personality of the individual. The term auditor is used in Dianetics to designate someone skilled in the practice of Dianetic therapy, called auditing. The conduct of an auditor is covered later. Chapter 4. The Basic Individual. For the purposes of this work, the terms basic individual and clear are nearly synonymous, since they denote the unaberrated self in complete integration and in a state of highest possible rationality. A clear is one who has become the basic individual through therapy. The precise personality of the basic individual is of interest to the auditor. His complete characteristic is established by 1. The strength of his basic dynamic, 2. The relative strengths of his dynamics, 3. The sensitivity, which is to say, the intelligence of his analyzer, 4. The coordination of his motor controls, 5. His physiological and glandular condition, 6. His environment and education. The experiences of each individual also create an individual composite, and so may additionally designate individuality. There are as many distinct individuals on earth as there are men, women, and children. That we can establish a common denominator of dynamic and basic function does not, cannot, and will not alter the fact that individuals are amazingly varied, one from the next. It will be found by experience and exhaustive research, as it has been clinically established, that the basic individual is invariably responsive in all the dynamics and is essentially good. There are varying degrees of courage, but in the basic individual, there is no pusillanimity. The virtues of the basic individual are innumerable. His intentional vices and destructive dramatizations are non-existent. He is cooperative, constructive, and possessed of purpose. In short, he is in close alignment with that ideal which mankind recognizes as an ideal. This is a necessary part of an auditor's working knowledge, since deviations from it denote the existence of aberration, and such departures are unnatural and enforced, and are no part of the self-determinism of the individual. Man is not a reactive animal. He is capable of self-determinism. He has willpower. He ordinarily has high analytical ability. He is rational and he is happy and integrated only when he is his own basic personality. The most desirable state in an individual is complete self-determinism. Such self-determinism may be altered and shaped to some degree by education and environment, but so long as the individual is not aberrated, he is in possession of self-determinism. So long as he is self-determined in his actions, he adjusts himself successfully to the degree that his environment will permit such an adjustment. He will be more forceful, effective, and happier in that environment than when aberrated. That the basic personality is good does not mean that he cannot be a terribly effective enemy of those things rationally recognizable as destructive to himself and to his. The basic individual is not a buried, unknown, or different person, but an intensity of all that is best and most able in the person. The basic individual equals the same person minus his pain and dramatizations. The dynamic strength of the person does not derive from his aberrations. The aberrations lessen the dynamic strength. Artistry, personal force, personality, all are residual in the basic personality. This is derived from clinical research and experimentation. The only reason an aberrated individual, occasionally holds hard to his aberrations is because his engrams have a content which forbids their removal. Chapter 5. Engrams. The reactive mind consists of a collection of experiences received during an unanalytical moment, which contains pain and actual or conceived antagonism to the survival of the individual. An engram is a perceptic entity which can be precisely defined. The aggregate of engrams compose the reactive mind. A new subfield entitled perceptics has been originated here to adequately define engramic data. Perceptics contains, as one of its facets, the field of semantics. Precisely as the field of semantics is organized, so is organized in perceptics each sensory perception. The audiosyllabic communication system of man has its counterpart in various languages observable in lower animals. Words are sounds in syllabic form, delivered with a definite timbre, pitch, and volume, or sight recognition in each case. Words are a highly specialized form of audioperceptics. The quality of the sound, uttering the word, is nearly as important as the word itself. The written word belongs in part to visioperceptics. Having but lately acquired his extensive vocabulary, the mind of man is least adjusted to words and their sense. The mind is better able to differentiate among qualities of utterance than among the meanings of words themselves. Included in perceptics, in the same fashion and on the same axioms as semantics, are the other sensory perceptions: organic sensation, the tactile sense, the olfactory sense, and the senses involved with sight and hearing. Each has its own grouping, and each carries its class of messages with highly complex meanings. Each one of these divisions of the senses is plotted in time, according to the earliest or most forceful significances. Each class of messages is so filed as to lead the individual toward pleasure and away from pain. The classifications and study of this varied sensory file have been designated perceptics. When injury or illness supplants the analytical mind, producing what is commonly known as unconsciousness, and when physical pain and antagonism to the survival of the organism are present, an engram is received by the individual. Subsequently, during moments when the potential of the analytical mind is reduced by weariness, illness, or similar circumstances, one or more of the perceptics contained in the engram may be observed by the individual in his environment, and without his perceiving that he has observed it, or the identity of it, the individual discovers himself in a dramatization of the moment of receipt of the engram. An engram impedes one or more dynamics of the basic individual. Being antagonistic to his survival, it can be considered analogically to consist of a reverse charge. As an example, the analytical mind can be said to possess multiple scanners and layers. Ordinary or pleasurable memory can be considered to have, as an analogy only, a positive charge. The multiple scanners are able to sweep these areas and make available memory data to the analytical mind so that it can arrive by various mathematical means at a solution for its various problems. The engram, as a specific memory package, can be considered to have a reverse charge, which cannot be reached by the scanners of the analytical mind, but which is directly connected to the motor controls and other physical functions, and which can exert, at a depth not nearly as basic as the basic dynamic, but nevertheless low, a hidden influence upon the analytical mind through another circuit. The analytical mind and awareness of now, nevertheless, is unable to discover, without therapeutic assistance, the existence of such an engram, since it was received during a moment of extremely low potential on the part of the analytical mind. As a further analogy, and for demonstration only, an engram can be considered to be a bundle of perceptions of a precise nature. An engram is an entire dramatic sequence implanted during unconsciousness, which possesses specific perceptic keys. any one of which, when unanalytically perceived by the individual in his environment, may in greater or lesser degrees set the engram into reaction. Denied to the analytical mind at its reception, it is denied to the analytical mind in its exact character during its dramatization. Its content is literal, and on the physio-animal level demands action. Man's analytical ability and his vocabulary are imposed above both the physio-animal mind and the reactive mind, both on the evolutionary time track and in awareness. The charge contained in the engram is inexhaustible and remains reactive in full force whenever keyed into the circuit by restimulators. Restimulators are those approximations in the environment of an individual of the content of an engram. Restimulators can exist in any of the various senses. The orderly filing of perceptics in the memory does not apparently include the content of engrams, these being filed separately under an immediate danger heading. There are three kinds of thought. The first is engrammic, or literal. It demands immediate action without examination by the analytical mind. A hand being withdrawn from a hot stove when burned is being governed by the reactive principle. But as the ensuing instant of unconsciousness caused by the shock is ordinarily slight, no real engram can be said to have formed. The second type of thought is justified thought. Engrammic thought is literal, without reason, irrational. Justified thought is the attempt of the analytical mind to explain the reactive engrammic reactions of the organism, or the mind, in the ordinary course of living. Every engram may cause some form of aberrated conduct on the part of the individual. Justified thought is the effort of the conscious mind to explain away that aberration, without admitting, as it cannot do normally, that it has failed the organism. The third and optimum type of thought is rational thought. This is the thought used by a clear. An engram is an apparent surcharge in the mental circuit with certain definite, finite content. That charge is not reached or examined by the analytical mind, but that charge is capable of acting as an independent command. When the basic dynamic of the individual is boosted in potential by an observed necessity, the residual charge in engrams is insufficient to contest, at times, the raised purpose. The analytical mind can then be seen to function in entire command of the organism, without serious modification by engrammic command. At other times, hostility in the environment and confusion of the analytical mind combine to reduce the dynamic potential to such a degree that the engrammic command, in comparison to the basic dynamic, can be seen to be extremely powerful. It is at such times, in the presence of even faint restimulators, that the individual most demonstrates his aberrations. An engram is severely painful or severely threatening to the survival of the organism, and is an engram only if it cannot be reached by the awake analytical mind. A simple approximation of the action of an engram can be accomplished by an experiment in hypnotism, whereby a positive suggestion is delivered to an amnesia-tranced patient, which contains a post-hypnotic signal. The subject, having been commanded to forget the suggestion when awake, will then perform the act. This suggestion is then actually a light portion of the reactive mind. It is literally interpreted, unquestioningly followed, since it is received during a period of unawareness by the analytical mind or some portion of it. The restimulator, which may be the act of the operator adjusting his tie, causes the subject to commit some act. The subject will then explain why he is doing what he is doing, no matter how illogical that action may be. The post-hypnotic suggestion is then recalled to the subject's mind, and he remembers it. The compulsion vanishes, unless it is laid upon an actual engram. The obedience of the subject to the command has, as its source, engrammic thought. The explanation by the subject for his own action is the analytical mind observing the organism, which it supposes to have in its sole charge, and justifying itself. The release of the post-hypnotic suggestion into the analytical mind brings about rational thought. Engrams can be considered to be painfully inflicted, often timeless, post-hypnotic suggestions delivered antagonistically to the unconscious subject. The post-hypnotic suggestion given the subject in the above example would not have any permanent effect on the subject. even if it were not removed by the operator, because there was presumed to be no antagonism involved, unless, of course, it rested on a former engram. For every engram, there is a somatic as part of that engram. No aberration exists without its somatics, unless it is a racial educational aberration, in which instance it is compatible with its environment, and so is not considered irrational. Every aberration contains its exact command in some engram. The number of engrams per individual are relatively few. The aberrated condition of the individual does not depend on the number of engrams, but the severity of individual engrams. An engram is severe in the exact ratio that it is conceived by the organism to have been a moment of threat to survival. The character of the threat and the perceptic content produces the aberration. A number of engrams with similar perceptics, engram chain, in an individual produce a complex aberration pattern, which nevertheless has for its parts individual engrams. Example: engram received at the age of 3½ years. Adult subject. As child in dental chair against his will, under antagonistic conditions, given nitrous oxide and tricked by dentist. During painful portion of treatment, the dentist says, "He is asleep. He can't hear, feel, or see anything. Stay there." The perceptics which can be restimulated in this are the quality, pitch, and volume of the dentist's voice, the sound of the dentist's drill, the slap of the cable running the drill, street noises of a specific kind, the tactile of the mouth being forcibly held open, the smell of the mask, the sound of running water, the smell of nitrous oxide, and, in short, several of each perceptic class, excluding only sight. The effect of this experience, being a part of an engram chain which contained two earlier experiences, precursors, was in some small degree to trance the individual and maintain some portion of him in a regressed state. This engram is too brief and extraordinarily simple, but it will serve as an example to the auditor. The timeless quality of the suggestions, the conceived antagonism, precursors on the engram chain, awakened and reinforced. All these things confused the time sense with the individual, and were otherwise reactive in later life. An aberration is the manifestation of an engram, and is serious only when it influences the competence of the individual in his environment. Engrams are of two types, depending upon the duration of restimulation. There are floaters and chronics. A floater has not been restimulated during the lifetime succeeding it in the individual. A chronic is an engram which has been more or less continuously restimulated, so that it has become an apparent portion of the individual. A chronic begins to gather locks. A floater has not accumulated locks, since it has never been restimulated. A lock is a painful mental experience. It is or is not regarded by the analytical mind as a source of difficulty or aberration. It is a period of mental anguish, and is wholly dependent upon an engram for its pain value. A lock can be conceived to be joined to an engram in such a way that it can be reached by the multiple scanners of the analytical mind which cannot reach the engram. When an engram is activated into a chronic, it accumulates numerous locks along the time track of the individual. The engram itself is not immediately locatable except somatically along the time track of the individual. Locks are of some diagnostic value, but as they exist as experiences, more or less recallable by the analytical mind, they can be depended upon to vanish upon the removal of the engram from the reactive mind without further therapy. The treating of a lock as a lock has some therapeutic value, but the exhaustion of locks from an aberrated individual is long and arduous, and is seldom productive of any lasting result. Upon the location and exhaustion of the engram from the reactive mind, all of its locks vanish. An engram may exist unactivated as a floater for any number of years, or for the entire duration of an individual's life. At any future moment after the receipt of an engram, whether that time period consists of days or decades, the floater may reactivate into a lock, at which time it becomes part of the commands obeyed by the analytical mind in its efforts to rationalize. The removal of the individual from his restimulators, which is to say the environment in which the engram was reactive, is in itself a form of therapy, since the engram may then return to its status as a floater. But such a return will not remove the locks which the analytical mind can then recall as painful experiences. Example: engram. At birth occurs the phrase, "no good," uttered during a moment of headache and gasping on the part of a child. Lock. At the age of 7, the mother, in a fit of rage while the child was ill with a minor malady, said that he was no good. The removal of the engram also removes, ordinarily without further attention, the lock. Note: birth remained inactive in the above case as a floater until the moment of reduced analytical power at the age of 7, when a birth phrase was repeated. It is worth remarking that the entire content of the birth engram is given simultaneously both to the child and to the mother, with only the difference of somatics. It is further worthy of note that the mother quite often perceives in the child a restimulator, and uses against it the phrases which were said when the child gave the mother the greatest pain, namely, birth. The child is then victimized into various psychosomatic ills by the repetition of its birth engram restimulators, which ills may develop even more seriously into actual disease. The mind controls the multiple and complex functions of the growth and condition of the organism. Containing organic sensation as one of its perceptics, the engram then, when reactivated, causes a somatic, and additionally may deny body fluids, i.e. hormones and blood, to some portion of the anatomy, occasioning psychosomatic ills. The denial of fluid or adequate blood supply may result in a potentially infective area. The psychosomatic reduces the resistance of some portion of the body to actual disease. Somatic and other sensory errors find their basis in unconscious antagonistic moments. A somatic may be adjusted by an address to a lock, but the permanency of adjustment obtains only until such time as the engram is again reactivated, causing another lock. All aberrations are occasioned by engrams. The physio-animal mind of an organism never ceases recording in some level. The exact moment when recording begins in an organism has not at this date been accurately determined. It has been found to be very early, probably earlier than 4 months after conception and 5 months before birth. In the presence of pain, any moment prior to the age of 2 years may be considered to be unanalytical. Any painful experience received by the fetus contains its full perceptic package, including darkness. Once an auditor has worked a prenatal engram and has seen its influence upon the engram chain and the awake life of the adult, no question will remain in his mind concerning the actuality of the experience. That the fetus does record is attributable to a phenomenon of the extension of perceptions during moments of pain and the absence of the analytical mind. Laboratory experiment demonstrates that under hypnosis, an individual's sensory perception may be artificially extended. The existence of pain in any large degree is sufficient to extend the hearing of the fetus, so that it records during the existence of pain and the presence of exterior sound the entire and complete record of the experience. As a chronic engram is but precariously fixed on the mind, the syllables or voice timbres contained in the prenatal will reactivate the somatic and the emotional engramic content whenever the approximations of that engram appear in the child's or the adult's vicinity. The understanding of language is not necessary to reactivate an engram, since the recording of the mind is so precise that the utterance of the identical words in similar tones during later prenatal periods, or during birth, or immediately after birth, can and may occasion the original prenatal or any of the prenatals to become reactive, producing locks, injuring the health of the infant, or for that matter, of the fetus. The perceptics of the fetus are extended only during moments of pain, but a chain of prenatal engrams can occasion a condition wherein the hearing of the fetus is chronically extended, forming numerous locks before birth. These locks will vanish when the actual engrams are discovered and exhausted from the psyche. Any painful, unanalytical moment containing antagonism is not only a matter of record, but a source of potential action in the human organism at any period during its lifetime. reserving, of course, the question of when the fetus first begins to record. Birth is ordinarily a severely painful unconscious experience. It is ordinarily an engram of some magnitude. Anyone who has been born, then, possesses at least one engram. Any period of absence of analytical power during receipt of physical pain has some engramic value. Moments when the analytical power is present in some quantity, when physical pain is absent and only antagonism to the organism is present, do not form engrams and are not responsible for the aberration of the individual. Sociological maladjustments, parental punishments of a minor sort, even when they include pain, libidos, childhood struggles, and jealousies, are not capable of aberrating the individual. These can influence the personality and environment adjustment of the individual, but so long as he is not pathologically incompetent, he can and will resolve these problems and remain without aberration. The human mind is an enormously powerful organism, and its analytical ability is great. It is not overlaid above naturally unsocial or evil desires, but is founded upon powerful and constructive basics, which only powerful, painful, and antagonistic experiences can impede. Engrams will be found to have been conceived by the individual as intensely antagonistic to the survival of the organism. The discovery of the basic engram is the first problem of the auditor. It normally results in an engram chain. The content of that chain will be found to be physically severe. An engram is physically painful, is conceived by the organism as an antagonistic threat to its survival, and is received during the absence of the analytical power of the mind. These factors may vary within the engram so that an engram may be of minimal pain, maximal antagonism, and minimal absence of the analytical power, but no engram is available to the scanners of the consciousness. Attention! One has as much functioning analyzer as one has awareness of now. The body is to some degree re-undergoing the experience of the engram whenever the experience is restimulated. A chronic psychosomatic, such as a painful arm, indicates the chronic continuous coexistence with now of the moment the arm is broken or hurt. Several engrams reactivated into a chronic state bring several moments of unconsciousness, pain, and antagonism into a coexistence with now. The engram is a bundle of perceptics, which include as the primary manifestation organic sensation. The organic sensation is enforced on the members of the body to a greater or lesser degree, whenever and as long as the engram is restimulated. There is only one psychosomatic, which is common to all engrams. Any engram contains this as part of the command it will enforce upon the body. The analytical mind is an organism and a part of the human body. As a stomach may be made to ache chronically, ulcers, to feel broken, the engram also enforces a command upon the organ of the analytical mind. That command is common to every engram. Engrams are valid only when they are received during a momentary dispersal of shocked null condition of the analytical mind. Every engram contains and enforces the command on the analytical mind that it has been dispersed and is not operating. This is common to every engram. This is reduction of the intellect by engrams, totally aside from specific engramic content. It explains at once insanity and the remarkable mental facility of a clear. Chapter 6. Aberrations. All aberrations of any kind are of precisely the same nature as covered in the last chapter. It is the content of the engram which causes the aberration and forms its nature. Complexity among engramic contents may demonstrate a most complex aberration. The various commands contained in the engrams, reactivating and modifying the basic dynamic command of the mind, produce abnormal characteristics in the behavior of the analytical mind, which are chronic or sporadic, as the engrams occasioning them are restimulated. An entire concept of existence may be built from engramic content. Conflicts in the commands contained in engrams and conflicts between the basic dynamic and the engramic content combine into behavior patterns. When the organism has become so aberrated that it can no longer adapt itself to this environment, it can be considered to be insane in that environment. Change of environment may relieve the condition, or more certainly, the exhaustion of the content of the reactive mind will restore the ability of the analytical mind to solve the problems with which it is confronted. Whatever the engramic content of the reactive mind and its potential influence upon the behavior of the individual, it does not necessarily follow that the reactive mind may be chronically restimulated. However, when the reactive mind has been restimulated consistently, the analytical mind called upon to solve the problems around and through antagonistic and incorrect data may be unable to perform its task. In the absence of disease or injury, any mind not in a physiological amentia state may be restored to normal function by the removal of the reactive mind. It should be noted, however, that this is modified by the fact that individuals who have received insulin shocks, prefrontal lobotomies, electric shocks, and other shock treatments are regarded as equivocal and are temporarily classed with disease cases for lack of adequate observation in this stage of the experimental research. People can be regarded as rational or irrational only insofar as they react in their customary environment. But any individual in possession of a reactive mind is an unknown quantity until that reactive mind has been examined. If he has been examined, his mind can be cleared in the same process. There are several factors which may be contained in the engrams in the reactive mind, which most certainly tend toward aberration. These include engramic commands, which derange the time sense of the individual, and thus apparently destroy his time track. Engrams which contain restimulators of such timelessness and such perceptic content that they remain thereafter continually with the individual and seem to arrest him or regress him in time. Engrams which contain commands that make the individual chronically unable to conceive differences are especially harmful, since these tend to compare everything to engramic value, and thus cause the individual to arrive at a chronic state of engramic thinking. The mind is an organism which resolves problems related to survival, utilizing its ability to conceive similarities and observe differences. Engrams which destroy or tend to hold in suspension the analytical mind's ability to conceive associations most influence the apparent intelligence of the mind. But engrams which tend by their command content to destroy the mind's ability to conceive differences may produce severe aberration. Example: all men are alike, received as powerful engramic content, would tend to compare every man and associate him with those men contained in the reactive mind as painful and dangerous. An aberration may attain any form or complexion. As a rough analogy, a compulsion may be conceived to be an engramic command that the organism must do something. A repression is a command that the organism must not do something. A neurosis is an emotional state containing conflicts and emotional data, inhibiting the abilities or welfare of the individual. And a psychosis is a conflict of commands which seriously reduce the individual's ability to solve his problems in his environment, to a point where he cannot adjust himself to some vital phase of his environmental needs. All this variety of manifestation of aberration is occasioned by the pain-enforced commands or contents of engrams. Physical aberrations are occasioned by engrams when they are not the result of injury or disease. Even then, the aspect may be improved by the exhaustion of the reactive mind of the sick individual. The engram cannot manifest itself as a mental aberration without also manifesting itself, to some degree, as somatic aberration. Removal of the somatic content of engrams, which is also necessary to obtain any other relief, can and does occasion glandular readjustment, cellular growth, cellular inhibition, and other physiological corrections. Chapter 7. The Tone Scale. The tone scale denotes numerically, first, the status of an engram in the reactive mind, next, its progress during work, and provides a measure of sanity in an individual. The derivation of this scale is clinical and is based upon observation of engrams during work. When an engram is located and developed, the extreme range it can follow begins with apathy, develops into anger, or the various facets of antagonism, proceeds into boredom, and arrives at last in cheerfulness, or vanishes utterly. The tone scale is essentially an assignation of numerical value by which engrams and individuals can be numerically classified. It is not arbitrary, but will be found to approximate some actual governing law in nature. Tone 0 is equivalent to death. An engram with 0 tone would be a death engram. An individual with a 0 tone would be dead. Ranging upward from 0 to 1 is then that emotional bracket which may be denoted as apathy, along its graduated scale from death to the beginnings of apathetic resentment. From 1 to 2 is the range of antagonism, including suspicion, resentment, and anger. Boredom and its equivalents, by which is denoted minor annoyance, begins at 2 and ends at 3. From 3 to 4 are the emotions which range from carelessness to cheerfulness. The term tone 4 denotes an engram or an individual who has achieved complete rationality and cheerfulness. The decimal scale can be used from 0.0 to 4.0 to approximate the emotional value of engrams and their ability to impede the dynamics. Each engram residual in the reactive mind has its own independent tonal value. Serious engrams will be found in the apathy range. Dangerous engrams will be found in the anger range. Above 2.5, an engram could not be considered to have any great value in affecting the analytical mind. Each engram in the reactive mind, then, can be said to possess a tone value. The composite sum of these engrams will give, if added, a numerical value to the reactive mind. Engrams can be computed as they lie along the dynamics, and to each dynamic may be assigned a tone. The sum of the tones of the dynamics divided by the number of the dynamics will give a potential numerical value for an individual. This, of course, is variable, depending on the existence of restimulators in his environment to reactivate the engrams. The general tone of an individual is important both in diagnosis and in establishing a resolution to the case. The probable average of mankind at this writing may be in the vicinity of 3.0. Complete rationality depends upon exhaustion of the reactive mind, and complete rationality is invariably the result of reaching tone 4. The initial diagnosis for a person in Dianetics is done by the assignation of a general tone to denote the condition of his reactive mind. His methods of meeting life, his emotional reaction to the problems in his environment, can be evaluated by the use of the tone scale. In therapy, as will be covered later, an engram normally can be expected to run from its initial value in the apathy or anger range to tone 4. Very shortly after it reaches tone 4, it should vanish. If it vanishes without attaining the laughter of tone 4, it can be assumed that the individual's basic engram has not been erased. The tone scale has value in the therapy and should be thoroughly understood. Chapter 8. The Character of Engrams. There are several general types of engrams. It must be understood that the mind possesses a time track of one sort or another, and that this track is a specific thing. The time track of an individual will include all those things available to his analytical mind. But the data which he can easily contact along his time track is definitely not engramic, even if it possesses an emotional charge. Everything on this track will be rational or justified experience. It will not include engrams. It may include locks or even engram locks, which is to say that it may include moments of mental anguish or antagonism, and may even include instances of unconsciousness which have some slight engramic value, and which are locks on some engram. An engram has several specific positive characteristics. It is received by the individual at some moment of physical pain. It is not available to the analyzer, and it includes conceived or actual antagonism to the survival of the organism. Certain mechanisms, such as forget it, may swerve a minimally painful or unconscious experience off the time track. In that case, it becomes possessed of engramic value. All engrams with power to derange the analytical mind and aberrate the physical body lie off the time track, and are not available to the analytical mind without auditor assistance. By reason of its disorganization during the moment the engram was received, or because it has been forcibly instructed that the data in the engram is not to be recalled, the analyzer cannot reach the engram by ordinary means because the data has been erroneously labeled dangerous, important, or too painful to touch. The engram then, by a bypass circuit, feeds hidden commands into the analyzer. By a direct instantaneous circuit, it is permanently connected to the motor controls, all perceptic channels, the glands, and heart. It is awaiting a moment of low general tone, weariness, or injury when the analytical mind has reduced powers. It is also awaiting the perception of one or more of the engram's restimulators in the environment of the organism. Continuous restimulation of the engrams can in itself cause a low general tone, which in its turn permits more engrams to become restimulated. As the reactive mind comes into a more or less completely chronic state of reaction, the individual becomes more and more governed by this mind. His thought becomes more and more engramic, and he can be seen to drop in general tone on the tone scale down to the breakpoint, which may be arbitrarily placed somewhere between 2.0 and 2.5, and below which lies the region of insanity. Engramic thought is irrational identity thought, by which the mind is made to conceive identities where only vague similarities may exist. It is necessary that the auditor thoroughly understand engramic thought, for it is with this complete irrationality of identity that he will basically deal. As he works with any individual, sane or insane, he must continually employ in the bulk of his computation on the case the equation of engramic thinking. Engramic thinking can be stated by A equals A equals A equals A equals A. The engram, when one or more of its restimulators is perceived in the environment during a moment of low general tone, may dramatize. The dramatization is the precise content of the engram. The aberration is the precise content of the engram. The reaction of an individual's analytical mind when an engram is reactivated is justification. There is reason to believe that part of this survival mechanism consists of the axiom: the analyzer must never permit an incorrect solution. The engram brings about many incorrect solutions. The analyzer may very well become entirely involved with the attempt to discover and deliver to a society or to itself adequate rational reasons for the behavior of the organism. The analytical mind, though working from the command of the engram itself, is unaware of the source of the command. Not being able to discover the source, it introverts more and more in an effort to solve a problem which contains danger to the organism. The analytical mind tends to find the danger without and within the organism. There are 5 ways that the organism can react to a danger in its vicinity. It can attack it, avoid it, neglect it, run from it, or succumb to it. In just these ways can the analytical mind, which it must be remembered is possessed of self-determinism and willpower, react to the reactive mind. As the general tone lowers, which is to say as the analytical mind becomes less and less powerful, through weariness, continual reverses in general health, etc., the more and more heed it must give to the problems unsolved in the reactive mind. These are in essence unsolved problems. As such, they contain their own solutions. The analytical mind, unable to reach them, justifies the organism's reaction to them, succumbs to them, causes the organism to attempt to flee from them, apathetically may neglect them, as in prefrontal lobotomy, avoids them in many intricate ways, or attacks them. The analytical mind is not only not certain where the experience lies on the time track, it also does not know whether the menace is within the organism or without it. So it can become entirely indiscriminate, and eventually it may achieve highly irrational solutions by which it seeks to solve the problems of the highly irrational reactive mind. The deep sensory perception channel entering the mind is evidently equipped with an appreciator, which sorts according to the momentary general tone or potential of the analytical mind. The higher the general tone, or potential of the analytical mind, the better the data in the appreciator is sorted. The appreciator circuits are evidently fully apprised of engrammic content in the reactive mind, and evaluate restimulators perceived in the environment against the general tone of the analytical mind. When that is low, restimulators route more or less directly to the reactive mind, which instantly responds by fixed connections into the motor controls. Commands to the various members, muscles, glands, and organs of the body may be sporadic or constant, producing a high variety of responses in the body. Entire vocabularies are fed into the voice circuits, directly from the reactive mind when an engram is restimulated. Orders to be active or inactive are fed to other portions. The individual time track of the engram spaces the commands to the organism, and a dramatization is accomplished which may contain a portion or all of the content of the engram as governed by the situation. Psychosomatic ills, hysterias, rages, tantrums, criminal acts, and any and all content prejudicial to the survival of the organism in which the organism is seen to be indulging, has as its source the reactive mind. The sole and only content of the reactive mind is what exterior sources have done to the organism. None of the content of the reactive mind is self-motivated. The auditor is then interested only in what is done to the person, not what the person himself has done, since for purposes of therapy, the acts of the organism in its society can be discounted beyond diagnosis. Even then, they are of small importance to the auditor. An organism possessed of an analytical mind not victimized by incapacitating disease or injury, and unaberrated, will commit no act knowingly prejudicial to the survival of the organism or other factors within the dynamics. It will combat only those dangers in society which are actual menaces. Whatever may be the status of the innate moral sense, the basic intent of the basic personality is to further various energy forms along the dynamic toward the goal. Only moments of actual dispersal of the awareness of the analytical mind permit data to be received, which is prejudicial to the intent of the dynamics. Only from these unconscious moments can the basically stable and enormously powerful and able analytical mind be aberrated through the implantation of unanalyzed, painfully administered, and antagonistic information. It is the purpose of the auditor to find and exhaust these moments from the life of the individual. This therapy includes, therefore, as its basic principle, the exhaustion of all the painfully unconscious moments of a person's life. By eradicating pain from the life of an individual, the auditor returns the individual to complete rationality and sanity. The auditor should never be content with merely bringing the individual back to normal. He should achieve with the individual a tone 4, even though this is far in advance of the average state of society at this time. A tone 4 with his dynamics intact and powerful, with his rationality and intelligence increased to the optimum, becomes extremely valuable to the society, whatever his past. Knowing this, the auditor can expect a maximum result of lasting duration with any person not physically hopeless. An auditor in Dianetics will achieve the best results by ignoring impulses to educate or inform the individual in any way beyond instructions sufficient to acquire cooperation. The entire purpose of the auditor is to rehabilitate the basic dynamic, the 4 dynamics, and the normal purpose or profession of the individual. Anything implanted by positive suggestion or education in the course of therapy is harmful and must be canceled if delivered. Only the basic personality of the individual can decide and evaluate things in his environment. Therefore, hypnotism as practiced with positive suggestion is shunned, since any and all hypnotic commands with the attendant forgetter mechanisms are no more than artificially implanted engrams. Indeed, it is quite usual for the auditor to have to exhaust hypnotically implanted material, received either from some hypnotist or from the individual's analytical mind itself when he is operating under quote-unquote self-control. Hypnotism, as such, does not work, and a study and short practice in Dianetics will reveal exactly why. The auditor is attempting to delete the reactive mind from the individual. This reactive mind is an infestation of foreign, careless, and unreasoning commands, which disrupt the self-determinism of the individual to such an extent that he no longer has charge, through his analytical mind, of the organism itself, but finds himself under the continual and chronic orders of unseen, never-reviewed exterior forces, often and usually antipathetic to the survival of the organism. Engrams deal with identities where no identities exist. They therefore pose many strange and irrational problems, which are seen as aberrations in people. If a human being has been born and not cleared, he can be supposed to have at least one engram. Anyone who has a birth which has not been cleared by therapy has, therefore, a reactive mind. There is no disgrace attached to having a reactive mind, since it was thrust, without his consent and without his knowledge, upon an unconscious and helpless individual. Sometimes this was done by people with the best of imaginable intentions. A person not possessed of a rational mind cannot be rationally considered to be morally responsible, no matter the demands of the current society, which hitherto lacked any method of determining responsibility. The pain contained in the reactive mind is normally severe. The usual parental punishments, family complications, reprimands, minor accidents, and the battle of the individual with his environment influence, but do not cause, a reactive mind. Nor do these things have the power to change materially the reactions of an individual. In the background of any individual exist many hidden personalities contained in the reactive mind. Dealing in identities, the reactive mind often confuses identities of individuals. Therefore, irrational attachments and antipathies are formed by aberrated individuals who can often find no reason for such attachments or antipathies in their contemporary environment. The content of an engram is literally interpreted, not as it was stated to the unconscious individual, but as it was received in its most literal phraseology and perception. The organism possesses many inherent mechanisms and abilities by which it can learn or preserve or forward itself along the dynamic. Any one of them may be exaggerated by engrams to a point where it becomes an actual threat to the organism or aberrates it. Engrams can and do aberrate all the sensory perceptions, any and all parts of the body, and the mind itself. By demanding suicide, the engram can destroy the entire organism. The error of the reactive mind was introduced by the evolution of speech, for which the basic mechanism was not designed. When all perceptics save speech formed the reactive mind, it was to some degree serviceable. With speech came such complexities of perception and such interchanges of ideas that a whole series of illusions and delusions could be derived from the reactive mind's necessity to determine identities for purposes of emergency. Without the reactive type mind, survival would be extremely difficult, since it must be there to care for emergencies during moments of dispersal of the analytical mind by shock or other means. With speech, the reactive mind came to possess far more power and extensive content. The analytical mind, being a delicate mechanism in some respects, no matter how rugged and capable in others, then could become subjected to delusions and illusions, which, however shadowy and unreal, must nevertheless be obeyed. By stripping the reactive mind of its past painful content, the analytical mind may be placed in complete command of the organism. The moment a man or a group becomes possessed of this ability, it becomes possessed of self-determinism. So long as these possess reactive minds, irrationalities will persist. Because it contains literal speech, no reactive mind can be conceived to be of any value whatsoever to the rational organism. Since the methods of that reactive mind remain intact and will continue to act to preserve the organism in times of unconsciousness of the analytical mind, there is no residual good in any reactive mind. It is capable of any illusion. It has no assist power along the dynamics, save only to cancel or modify other reactive mind content. The source of the individual's power and purpose is not derived from the reactive mind, but from the basic dynamic and from the four dynamics. Any auditor will establish this to his own satisfaction after he has cleared a very few cases. When an individual is attempting to hold on to his aberrations, the auditor may be assured that that person has, as part of the content of the reactive mind, such phrases as, "Don't dare get rid of it," which identically translated apparently applies to aberrations. It may in fact apply in an engram containing an attempted abortion. The identity factor in the reactive mind may cause the analytical mind to respond irrationally to treatment, and to justify the aberrations in many irrational ways. Whatever means he uses, or statements he makes to avoid the exhaustion of his reactive mind, is contained exactly in the reactive mind as a positive suggestion, and has no application whatsoever in rational thought. Individuality, if by that is meant a man's desires and habits, is not traced to the reactive mind, save when by individuality is meant those flagrant eccentricities which pass in Dickens for characters. A man is much more individual after his reactive mind has been cleared.